It's exciting today. I have a special guest, and we're going to talk about some more Docker internals and some of the things that make Docker work. So with me, I have Phil Estes from Virginia. He works at IBM as a distinguished engineer.
Yep.
Yeah, that was a recent cool thing that happened. And
Yeah.
you work on the cloud team. So tell a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So yeah, at IBM, been working for like 4 years in our cloud unit, which public cloud, private cloud, we have offerings across that space. Bunch of different runtimes in our cloud, and obviously containers got very, very exciting in the last several years. And the cloud unit said, hey, let's get some people involved in the Docker open source project. So that was about 4 years ago.
An eternity.
Yeah, very, very long time ago. So, so I started contributing, became a maintainer in the Docker engine, and somehow managed to still try and keep my open source chops in the ContainerD project, which I think we'll introduce
Yeah.
a little bit about that. But yeah, so I done a lot of upstream contribution, and that's led to some leadership in IBM around how open source is used in our cloud, how our container service actually operates. In a sense, almost being like a consultant to other parts of IBM about containerization and all those exciting things that the world is talking about these days.
Yeah, very cool. I know I'm always hearing updates from you in the Captain channel, which we're both part of the Docker Captains program, and I'm always hearing updates from the IBM Cloud and all the innovation you guys are doing over there. So that's a really cool thing. So so you got started early with Docker, started actually adding code to the Docker engine, and then somewhere in the last year we started hearing news about this ContainerD thing. ContainerD with like a container with D on the end, I guess one word.
Right.
And it was a little bit hard for some of us to figure out, like, is this different than Docker? Is this a replacement for Docker? What is this? Is this a part of the Docker tools?
Right. Yeah. So we can't really talk about ContainerD without talking about something else that happened in the industry. So early on in my time in Docker, it was actually almost a couple years into their life as an open source project. There was some discussion about a splintering of the community. CoreOS had this new Rocket container runtime, and out of that came this Open Container Initiative, a foundation, if you will, kind of underneath the umbrella of the Linux Foundation. The goal there was like, hey, let's all get together, Docker, Microsoft, IBM, Google, CoreOS, Red Hat, all the big players, and let's decide what a container runtime does. What is a container and how do you run it?
Yeah.
And then what is a container image, and can we put some specifications around these two things? So that out of that came a binary called runc that every installation of Docker today has this binary. You may never interact with it, but that's what's actually executing your containers, and that allows people out other than Docker to create container runtimes that all use this standard executor.
Right.
At the same time that came out, Michael Crosby at Docker wrote a small daemon called ContainerD that would just drive the runc binary. So Docker would say, I'd type Docker run Ubuntu, a OCI configuration would be assembled and handed down to ContainerD, who would then manage the lifecycle of that runc process of my actual Ubuntu container that's running. So
instead of like this monolithic daemon that did everything when you did Docker run, you were sort of splintering out the parts of it where it made sense to maybe standardize in the industry on something that we could all agree on. Yeah.
Right. So it did a couple interesting things. One, it allows runc to be pluggable. So if anyone's ever heard of Hyper-V or Intel Clear Containers, you could create another binary and put that underneath the Docker engine and do interesting things like isolate with a hypervisor around your container.
Yeah.
So runc allowed that kind of innovation. And then by separating ContainerD out, the Docker engine itself could actually update or crash and come back, and all your containers could still be running.
Yeah,
because you have this separation of concerns.
Yeah.
So yeah, breaking the monolith is kind of part of what's happened here over the last few years. That early ContainerD didn't get as much, kind of global interest, so to speak, because it really was just kind of part of the you installed Docker, you didn't really know anything about this ContainerD. What really raised the level of interest in ContainerD is that Docker, along with some other partners and those of us who were interested in this discussion, let's actually make ContainerD more of like a stable core runtime that you could use fully to integrate with other container platforms other than just the Docker opinionated platform.
So a little more feature set than originally planned. Like
exactly.
A little more.
So that first ContainerD, just managing run C processes, supervising container starts and exits, handling the signaling. ContainerD kind of 1.x was announced, I think, December 2016 in a blog post on the Docker blog, that it would become, again, more featureful than the prior ContainerD, including registry interactions, so pulling images, pushing images. It would have some simple back-end drivers for the layers, and which the original ContainerD did not have that as well. So again, part of that was to provide this unopinionated runtime that then the Kubernetes community could utilize. Again, they had been using the full Docker engine. There have been some complaints about as Docker moves down their their march of versions throughout the year, things are breaking in Kubernetes. And so ContainerD was seen as an answer for this kind of middle tier runtime that both Docker could continue using, which it still does today, but also Kubernetes and others could embed it and use it.
Other orchestrators, higher level tools. So
Right.
you've got ContainerD. So today we have ContainerD 1. something.
Yeah, 1.1 is out.
Yeah, and is that used in the Docker engine now, like all?
Yes. So the interesting thing is that when you install the Docker engine today, so any of the last 3 or 4 monthly releases have ContainerD 1.x and maybe recently 1.1. But if you think about it, Docker had all these features, right? Push, pull, etc., built into the Docker daemon binary. So there's going to be months of work to start to refactor Docker to utilize those features out of ContainerD.
Instead of Instead.
So ContainerD itself could do some of these things, but Docker is not using some of those features because they still have the code in Docker daemon. So
it's kind of similar to Kubernetes too, right? Like you've got the Kubernetes API that does things that Docker might do inside the engine itself, but Kubernetes has a different opinion, so they do those things instead of it. And I guess that was part of the original thought process, was we all had to kind of come to agreement on what do we want this core what do we want in a runtime, and what do we want as a higher level tool where we get maybe more opinionated. I think kind of now we've all sort of agreed upon how you start one, how you push and pull an image, how you maybe store an image, how do you break up those layers, but maybe how you do networking or create networking is not in ContainerD, right?
Yeah. So there were a bunch of decisions made early on to say let's not add another opinion to the mix for an area that already has a lot of options. So when ContainerD is used by Kubernetes, then you need a CNI plugin in that installation that manages
for your networking.
When ContainerD is used by the Docker engine, obviously the libnetwork and the Docker engine provide networking. So ContainerD doesn't have an opinion, doesn't provide an implementation for networking at all.
Right. Yeah. So that sounds like a lot of stuff. Is it for someone who's just an end user of Docker today or Kubernetes? Maybe they're using Docker on a single machine, maybe they're using Docker Swarm, or maybe they're using Kubernetes or a flavor of Kubernetes like AKS or EKS rather, and like Rancher. Or, how much do they have to care about ContainerD?
Yeah, so I said this, I guess, last week in a talk at DockerCon, discussing with someone. You really shouldn't have to. An end user shouldn't have to worry about who's actually running my containers, what tool, what daemon. Where it gets interesting is with operators. So if you're going to operate your own Kubernetes cluster and you're going to use ContainerD, then you're probably going to learn some rudimentary CTR, which is our client, commands to do the same things you do with Docker PS, Docker push, pull. Again, that's more administrative and debug related than you're not going to push that experience to your end users.
Right.
They're still going to use the Docker client or they're going to use the Kubernetes API. So we don't ever see really ContainerD filling any space targeted at end users.
Right.
It's really embedded within a larger stack of software that's providing a UX for end users.
So maybe for like the Docker end user today, maybe it's good to understand what this is about, and maybe that the industry is at least coming together on this base core level, so that we can make that like rock solid, super secure, and really just make it easier for us to build a lot more tools. In fact, I was having a discussion today around orchestrators because someone asked about Netflix's Titus. Is it Titus?
Yep, Titus.
And I was just replying with, well, we've got, Titus just got released. We had the Azure Fabric, Service Fabric released a couple months ago. Like, we maybe thought we were done creating orchestrators, but the more we create these easier low-level tools, talked about possibly Cloud Foundry maybe moving to ContainerD, or if
they've been using Runc and they're on their way to switch to ContainerD.
Yeah, so I mean, like eventually you would end up with all these tools, and it just makes it easier for us to make highly opinionated orchestrators. I feel like on top of these existing tools.
Yeah.
We get a lot of questions throughout the community around like machine learning and GPUs and stuff like that, or job engines where people specifically want to do batch processing, and sometimes the generic orchestrators aren't really the best place for those. And I wouldn't be surprised if we saw what you would in traditional computing, we would see like a traditional VM orchestration tool that had no pre-container, that didn't understand containers. And they would create whole solutions that would know how to deploy instances and manage those instances. And now they could potentially replace Swarm or Kubernetes with something that's like a higher or just stack on top of those tools as a higher level layer that manages all that stuff. So I think sometimes one of the hardest things for new people in Docker to figure out is which tools do I need to learn and which tools can I avoid. And I sometimes feel like as cool as ContainerD is, it's probably a tool that they could avoid simply because there's a higher level tool for them, unless they're building out a complete data center of servers. And if they don't have 1,000 servers to physically manage, then they might be able to get away with another orchestrator, another command line tool.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about ContainerD, and I'm doing it again next week at QCon in New York, it's mostly for awareness. Here are the technologies that are being used to run your containers. Here's how Kubernetes has abstracted the container runtime interface, CRI, which is how it drives container engines like Docker or ContainerD or other options. So, the awareness can be useful for those who just kind of want to know how things are operating, but as an end user, there's definitely no sense in which we're pushing, hey, go learn ContainerD, it's another,
you
stack to go figure out. And
you want to learn what Docker is? Go use ContainerD. Day 101. Yeah. Well, and that's tough because there's so many tools in the stack. It sometimes is a little tricky. And the news loves to talk about whatever's new, regardless of whether the audiences will relate to that tool or whether anyone, So very cool. Is there anything like what do you think there's a ContainerD 1.2 that's going to have like a new feature or two in it?
So there's a couple things in the pipeline. Microsoft has been involved getting some of their WCAL and LCAL, which are acronyms, Windows containers on Windows, Linux containers on Windows. So those features are dropping into ContainerD to make sure that the Windows support is fully there. So again, some of that is provided today. Docker announced Docker
does that,
EE across Windows and Linux. Obviously, for Kubernetes, aside from the Docker engine to be viable, some of those features have to be in ContainerD. Michael Crosby has a PR for the GPU support. So again,
that's right. We heard about that last week. Yeah.
So that's in the pipeline for 1.2. And I mean the interesting thing is that it's really at Runc and ContainerD where new Linux kernel container features kind of bubble up through those layers, so that things like Docker and Kubernetes can exploit new security capabilities, and so there's kind of not a huge flow, and again, not all of them are interesting to the end user, but ways that the kernel is expanding, the containerization, isolation primitives to be more secure, and turn on this flag and make sure that no new privileges can be added once you're in this mode. So all those features kind of come up through Runc and ContainerD before they end up in your Docker engine or Kubernetes stack. So, cool. those aren't always terribly exciting features, but that's kind of where we see ContainerD just a steady kind of keeping up with the industry and the basic functions that will be needed by higher layer tools.
For every one of those features, there's someone on GitHub issues going +1, +1, +1, +1.
Right.
So there's always at least one GitHub issue related to those that people are wishing they had out of these container solutions.
Yep.
So you're going to be in QCon next week.
Yep, in New York.
And you're talking about ContainerD.
Yeah, so the talk is like a deep dive on Kubernetes CRI, the Container Runtime Interface. I'll be focusing on ContainerD and kind of revealing that, in public clouds, it's really having some pretty reasonable adoption. GKE just announced new beta clusters can choose ContainerD as the runtime. And IBM, we have ContainerD in our staging clusters, our Kubernetes offering. I know people at Azure have been playing around with ContainerD. And then, like I said, Cloud Foundry, they're shifting from Runc with their own code around it to say, hey, ContainerD has some of this management code that we could get rid of. So there's interesting to see a lot of interest. Amazon has been using it. Their registry team has been using ContainerD, and they have more work to do with ECS and their new EKS to consider whether they could use a single runtime rather than Docker and ContainerD across their Kubernetes and their ECS offering. So they're still looking at all that.
I feel like we're getting, this is like becoming the open SSL of containers, where like today OpenSSL just drives everything. Almost every project out there that requires any sort of encryption at the HTTP layer is you've been using that package, and basically the goal of ContainerD is kind of like it won, that it's now going to be the standard everywhere, or at least the default, and that there will be other options, other opinions, and that that also means that while it will be universally standard, it also means like it now has to every consideration has to consider every platform that's using it, so it becomes even harder to manage. So you guys got some work ahead of you. It's exciting that we're sort of opening more of the stack and getting sort of microservice-y around container feature sets and all that. So if you want to check out ContainerD, if you think you want to get geeky with the tools, is that ContainerD.io, is that right?
Yes, and that will take you to our GitHub or some of the other resources that we have out there. And I have some talks that I've posted on SlideShare and on Twitter. If you're looking to just hear a little bit more, there's some good ContainerD talks. Steve and Dave from Formula Docker also has some talks up on ContainerD. So
he's also really interesting to listen to.
So
where can people find you on the internet?
Estes P on Twitter is probably the easiest place.
I'll put that in the description of this video so you can find it.
In the video description. And then I've tried to grab Estes P about everywhere, so you can GitHub and around the interwebs, you can find me there. So.
Right. All right, before you go, we have a few questions. We have what's going on with Rocket?
Oh.
By Nirmal.
Nirmal. Okay.
Plant.
That's a good question. Red Hat purchased CoreOS. With that, obviously, Red Hat becomes in some sense, that's their
maintainer.
They're maintaining that. The team, Kinvoke, a German contract company, and I hope I'm representing them well. Great people that did a lot of the maintainership over the last few years. I think they're not being funded to continue on Rocket, so I'm not sure how many active people are on Rocket, the open source project, and I'm not sure how it fits with Red Hat's creation of Creo, which is an implementation of the Kubernetes CRI, just using Runc in their own management code.
Right.
So rather than ContainerD being Runc with our set of libraries, Red Hat has created Creo, effectively an alternative.
So now they're making their own. They don't necessarily need Rocket because they.
I mean that's yeah. I mean that's my perspective. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Because they also had a plugin for Kubernetes called RocketNetties to use Rocket as the runtime. And I heard a status update on that from the Kinvoke team in February at FOSDEM. But I also heard that some parts of it aren't complete, so that it doesn't actually do all the operations that a full Kubernetes would need. So that's all I know. I definitely don't want to throw shade on Rocket just because I haven't really kept up with their community, but that's as much as I kind of know where they are today.
Right. Looks like we have Brian on there saying hi. Hello, Brian.
Hey, Brian.
Nirmal's asking another question about GPU connectivity.
Yeah.
ContainerD GPU.
Yeah. I mean, I can point you at the pull request. The NVIDIA folks did give their input and were involved in some way to make sure that it was correct as far as how some of the NVIDIA tooling and packaging works. So there was some thumbs up. This looks right. Nirmal, I'm no GPU expert, so beyond that we can.
Is that a Moby? You think?
No, ContainerD.
All right.
On GitHub. Yep.
No. Okay.
Yeah, we can tell you the pull request.
Oh, no, PR
Actually,
is.
maybe we merged it. Look at closed, or that works.
Only one.
Yep. So it was merged 12 days ago.
Number 2330.
Oh, and I merged it.
Yeah, sure you did. It was your robot.
Yeah.
Merch. There you go.
Yeah. So.
We'll put that in there. Boom.
Yeah. So yeah, check it out, Nirmal. And if we're missing important features from experts on GPU, it'd be great if people could.
So this makes the whole NVIDIA fork of Docker like irrelevant now, or replaceable.
Oh boy, now you're asking hard questions. So yeah, I mean they have some tools that are required to because you're actually setting up devices on the host and making connections to a container. It's a tricky area.
There's a lot in this thing, so there's probably some knowledge in there about
you can definitely read some thoughts about
what it takes.
How should we be hooking and calling the NVIDIA binary at this point? You can read about kind of some of those decisions and how they came about. So
lib. Yeah, NVIDIA ContainerD CLI.
Yeah.
Cool stuff.
Yeah.
All right, so we know how to get you on the internet. We've answered all the questions. The fork is atrocious. I'm reading your comments live. You better be careful there, sir. Hope you don't have any friends there at NVIDIA. So thanks you so much for stopping by. Yeah. This is cool. I'm glad you're in town visiting the beach and enjoying the sun.
Yeah,
and
this is
awesome.
It's
actually nice this week. It's not a rainy week. That seems like that happens all the time when friends come.
Yeah,
so
this is awesome.
We just saw each other at DockerCon last week. When are we going to see each other again?
Oh, that's a good question.
You're going to You're going to QCon. We're going to go to maybe definitely DockerCon EU, right?
Yeah,
that's going to be in the fall.
Barcelona in December.
I'm going to a couple of go-to conferences in.
You're doing the
New York. I'm doing some O'Reilly. Yes, one in Copenhagen. I'm doing the O'Reilly Velocities in New York City and London.
Okay.
I don't know if you're.
Yeah, I to be honest, I haven't
It's too far away.
Yeah,
It's 3 months away. It's too far.
Haven't figured out fall travels, but there's a lot of conferences this fall.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Siri wants to answer your question.
Yeah, we just woke up Siri.
Well, cool. Well, thanks for stopping by.
Yeah.
And thank you, Internet, for watching. We'll see you again later on YouTube Live.
All right. Thanks.